Cameras record. Could you guys all please clap for us? Actually, just Tom. So based upon our studies, we found that the majority of people classify cults as something particularly religious and always extremist. Do you agree with this, and why? Sort of what other definitions of cults can you think of, if you have any, at all, or do you strongly agree or disagree with this? Sort of discuss this amongst yourselves, and then once you feel like you've all got an answer, we'll go through you individually as well as having a group answer, and get your thoughts on that.
Yeah.
Wow. I think the definition of a cult is quite loose. Like, I think according to that definition, like terrorist groups and things would be considered a cult. But I wouldn't say like groups like ISIS are cults. So yeah, I think there's a lot of subjectivity to what you class as a cult.
I don't suppose it's specifically religious, but the way they sort of think about things is kind of like a religion in itself. I read about something called like the Saturn Death Cult or something, and they celebrated Saturn as their god.
Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
I read it a while ago. It was like years and years and years ago. There was like a golden age of man, and they celebrated Saturn as this, because the Saturn was a big gas body in the sky. They celebrated that as the sun, but some catastrophic event happened and it turned the solar system into what we know it is today. And in 2001: Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick was going to do the shoot to Saturn. And some of the theories was that this cult had got in touch with him and said, no, don't do Saturn, do Jupiter instead.
Interesting. So would you perhaps say that has sort of links to things like more well-known cults such as Scientology?
Yeah, they take something that's not like inherently religious. Like the planet Saturn, there's nothing inherently religious about it, but they apply things like with Saturn. There's a hexagonal sort of storm at the bottom, isn't there? That they can't really explain. And they said when that was the gaseous body in the sky, that hexagonal was the eye looking down on Earth.
Yeah. So yeah, has anybody else got any sort of opinions on how it could be, sort of perhaps anything but religious?
I kind of picture it, I don't know if it's just from the way I was like taught from doing sociology, that the media perception of cult always seems quite negative and primitive, and people with pitchforks or like the KKK or Mayan people like sacrificing whatever. But like we learned that a sect was the more like dangerous version, extremist group, and that was what it was referred to as, whereas a cult wasn't necessarily bad, but because of what everyone else is exposed to, when you hear the word cult you just think, oh, it's a scary thing that's quite violent.
It's interesting. So elaborate on the sort of differences you guys perhaps think when do you think there's a difference between a sect and a cult? Personally, like, do you think, do you notice a difference between the two, or do you feel that those two terms are kind of interchangeable?
I don't really know what a sect is, so.
Yeah.
I've always thought that a sect is something definitely something more violent, but I've also thought of sects as sort of like subgroups of terrorist groups. But I'd always thought that the Baader-Meinhof gang was a sect, but obviously had connections to other terrorist groups. But yeah, I definitely think they're interchangeable, those two terms.
Yeah.
Would you consider sort of political? Is there any certain political party you would consider a cult, perhaps? Whether it be a cult of personality or something of that nature. Cults got quite a wide basis these days, and like critical reception on it seems to be quite growing and things such as that. Like the terms are ever expanding, and it becomes the lines are blurred. For example, even though people like Jeremy Corbyn and Donald Trump are at completely different ends of the spectrum, people have cited the way that they disseminate information and get people onto their side is a sort of cult of personality, and kind of is very similar in the way that they actually talk about things. Would you agree with that?
it's different with politics. I think politics is too big, and there's a difference between like following on a personality and a small group of people getting together and sort of getting passionate about something. I don't know. I don't know if I consider like a group of people getting together and celebrating Jeremy Corbyn as a cult.
I think people
Much
in
like
like
a
politics mainly use like cult to just mean like they'll defend them no matter what, as opposed to like having an open mind.
Yeah.
Like if you think of people describing political beliefs as a cult, it's mainly just like, oh, they all have one belief that they're willing to defend and not really hear any other opinions on it.
So it's interesting then that, you know, a lot of people seem to think that cults can't particularly infiltrate something as big as politics, particularly going back to what Dan said. Do you think of cults as something that's very insular and small, and, you know, can't bleed out, perhaps?
I don't know. I think obviously the reason why cults exist is because they attract people. I think like say cults like the Ku Klux Klan. They're very attractive to certain types of people because they share the same views, and there are a lot of racist people about, but they don't necessarily all join the Ku Klux Klan, do they? They make their ways into other groups, so like the BNP, or you know, to a lesser extent, not calling them racist, but UKIP. I think they're not the same thing, but there's definitely a lot of racist people who vote for UKIP.
You see, with the Ku Klux Klan, I don't know if I consider that a cult. Why is the Ku Klux Klan a cult and ISIS is not? They're both basically terrorist groups. And where's the line being drawn there?
Could you guys discuss that a little bit more, like your sort of differing definitions, perhaps?
Well, again, that might come from the fact that I'm not like trying to make a broad statement, but some people see it calling like something like the KKK or just like a white supremacist group terrorism, as opposed to some like Arabic group where it's instantly labelled as that.
So on a closing note on that question, perhaps, do you think that you know, cults can be defined, or do you think they're sort of very much dependent upon an individual's socio-political backgrounds?
I don't think there's ever going to be a clear definition. I think it's always going to be open to subjectivity. Because in the case of like the Ku Klux Klan, I think that like their beliefs, I think, are very much have been ingrained in American society since I think day one.
I know. I find it interesting that I've never really, and now I think about it, they are totally a cult in what the broader definitions in popular culture are. But as Dan said, I personally, as the person sort of doing this, and I know it's got to keep objective, but I know it's going to lead into something here. But you know, what sort of familial connections and things like that have perhaps informed that decision on you seeing them as a cult?
The fact that they're very, like I said before, that they attract others, but they're also still very inclusive. Like they do things together, you know, like rituals like burning of the crosses and things. I think that's very, like things like that. I think I always relate to cults.
Do you think the idea of ritual is core to that sort of cultic identity?
Perhaps, but then you'd be treading into the line of like, is an American fraternity a cult because they do rituals to like put people into that group, but then not necessarily going out preaching an ideology. But I suppose at the same time they do that to like show that you're part of a community and that you're loyal to it, which I guess then is like a cult thing.
I imagine. And do you think perhaps that, you know, it has to be that when these harmful elements are introduced, that's when, you know, you can start sort of beginning to poke out the definitions of a cult? You know, do you think they inherently have to be harmful to be considered what popular culture sees as a cult? You know, what audiences would react to as a cult?
No, but now that I think about it, I've been talking about the Ku Klux Klan as if, like, back when they were murdering people, I've kind of forgotten that they're still a thing. But I guess nowadays I would kind of consider them more of a cult than a terrorist organisation, because they do exist in their small little pockets. They don't have as much of an influence as they must have done back then. So I guess they've kind of gone from what I would consider a terrorist organisation to more of something that resembles a cult as recently.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I've also always thought of cults, I don't think, try to inflict their beliefs on other people, unlike terrorist groups who, you know, deliberately try to create terror in order to sort of encourage people or scare people into believing what they believe. Whereas I think with cults, I think if you don't, like, they feel that if you don't have that mindset from the beginning, you don't belong. Like, definitely in the case of Ku Klux Klan, like, you can't be black and be in the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah.
But I think, like, other groups, like, say, like, I don't know, the Nazi Party, they wanted everyone to believe in this one certain thing, and they were trying to basically, not encourage, but persuade a whole country to believe that way. Whereas I think...
The whole country minus the exception of, you know, Jews and things like that, though. So there are exceptions here and there. Even with the Ku Klux Klan, you've seen things such as there was that guy who was mates with the Ku Klux Klan who was black, which is a very interesting documentary if you want to follow it up. And it kind of, you know, it kind of highlights that. From my research with a lady called Claire Ashman, who was in a cult from a very young age, married into it when she was about 18, has had 12 kids in the cult. She says that she didn't realise that she was in that mindset or believed that she was in that particular mindset they wanted until she actually did her research on what other people thought of her, you know, cult. And then that she said that she mentally disassociated herself with that. So, you know, what's your opinion on that? Do you think that you can be passively sort of drifted into these cults, or do you think it's something that the person actively engages in?
Then, like, by that logic, my mind goes to if, like, someone is brought up in that sort of way, I think of, like, Amish people.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't consider them a cult, I just consider that like a society.
You, correct me if I'm wrong, but you grew up on a military camp, right?
Yeah, for a while.
Did you feel like that was a sort of, like, closed gay community, in a way? Like you had a certain, not a disconnect from outside life, but a kind of, you know, a place that could be considered its own community?
I think, not that it was closed off in any way, because we'd often travel outside, but I could understand from a perspective, like, growing up, I was surrounded by people who spoke English, but in a non-English speaking country.
Yeah.
And it would remain that way, like, we'd rarely come in contact with people who spoke German, and they were, say, like an ice cream man who'd come and drive onto the barracks.
Yeah.
But I don't think I ever felt integrated into a specific mindset, but no, I could understand from an outside perspective, because I know that it wasn't necessary, like, it wasn't exactly well liked that it was there, to put it that way, the
Yeah.
place, and it's closed down now.
Yeah.
But no.
So do you think maybe that mentality of, you know, that's kind of demonstrated something that you didn't see? You know, I saw it as quite a closed off community. Like, I wouldn't approach that place and go, yeah, I can go in there. In
Yeah.
fact, because it's a military barracks, and the outside perception of it, people see it as hostile, but because you were in it, you didn't see that. Do you think that kind of goes for cults and things? Do you think that kind of mentality could spread into something more extreme and something more, you know, volatile? Or do you think that volatile nature dissuades that kind of thing? Do you think people like, no matter, you know, what their belief, even if that most hardcore supporters do realise that these dark elements are, you know, part of it?
I think personally, I'm not sure, but when I think of a cult, I think of something that could pose as a moral panic for other people who are in it. But I think when it goes beyond that and it becomes violent or hostile to people outside of it, then it goes beyond being a cult, because it's not about their own belief system, it's inflicting, like, harm or whatever onto other people, and then that's terrorism.
And do you think that all cults particularly do have, you know, in regards to their leader, do you think that they do serve a certain person or a certain end? You know, there isn't a certain, that, you know, they aren't actually going for what they say they are? Or do you think that there is room for, you know, certain cults to actually believe in what they do believe? you know, at a hierarchical level, sort of like right at the top, do you think that there are cults that, you know, can believe in that, or do you think it's very much correct, a sweeping statement of there's always an end goal to this person, whether it be political or indeed personal?
My idea of a cult is just a small group of people that are quite fanatical about something. That doesn't necessarily have to lead anywhere. It's just the celebration of a specific, I don't know, thought or way of life. Or
So this is a question that's almost been sort of regurgitated, I suppose, all in a way from one of the questionnaires. You know, does it surprise you to sort of see that 900 people died in Jonestown as part of the cult?
yeah,
And, you know, something that big, and there was actually well over 2,000 people in that. And things. I know that's still a relatively small number, but is that the smallness you would think of, or were you thinking a much lower number, much lower population, something that doesn't amount to, say, you know, a small town in that instance?
oh, yeah, I forget what there's I know about an Indian bloke, and he was some sort of leader of a cult, and that ended up in the cult poisoning the water supply of somewhere in America. So no, this was literally, it had a small gathering, and that had turned into almost, they built a town around this sort of person so that they could celebrate this person, and
Yeah.
so it kind of expanded into its own town. So I guess the size of 900 people sounds like a lot. That seems like quite extreme, but
Yeah. Some of the more extreme cases that people do remember tend to be in the high death tolls. You know, Waco, one of the subjects we're looking into, he lost his wife and his mum there, and 80 people died there. Yeah, and it tend to be, I think that's why these flashpoints are remembered so much and seen as so hostile back. So thanks for your contribution on that. Just got a couple more questions. They'll be a lot more concise than that one. That was a much more broad to sort of set the tone on that. But from all the cult documentaries, films, books, and other media you guys have consumed, sort of, you know, what do you feel is the core attraction? Please discuss that amongst yourself before coming back with an answer on that.
The core attraction of joining a cult?
No, the core attraction of you know, films, that you
Oh,
see,
right, okay.
books. Your core interest in cult
Right.
media, I suppose.
I suppose it's just looking at something that's already been released in a different way. Like films get released and nobody likes them, but years down the line, people look at them again and go, actually, you know, there's some sort of other meaning I can take from this, or you know, there's a celebration of something, maybe just in the way that it was done, textual elements that people may not have picked up on in the beginning.
Yeah, I think recently there's been like this sort of fascination with true crime documentaries, and I think cults definitely fit that bracket. There's a documentary recently called Wild Countries, something like that.
Very popular.
About, yeah, and that I think there's something about, I think documentaries in particular, where we're actually seeing these people and then actually hearing about what instead of just seeing, like in like a adaptation, you know, it's hard, it's easy to not believe it because obviously things like inaccuracies and things creep in, but also just because you're not actually seeing what actually happened. Whereas in like documentaries, I think you get a more of a grasp on like what, like the authenticity of what actually happened.
Yeah.
So I think documentaries are, as at the moment anyway, I think they're more popular just because I think people are more shocked by. It's easy to get shocked by, you know, an actual footage of someone, I don't know, being indoctrinated to a cult than just seeing a recreation of it on film or TV.
Have any of you guys had similar experiences with you know, cult documentaries and their core appeal? Do you guys agree with that, or?
I think like, yeah, the personal stories of like people who have been in cults, like obviously you think of a cult, you automatically think it's bad.
Yeah.
And then you watch these documentaries of people who are like, they seem like good people, and it just sort of, it's like you don't want to think that they're good people, but it's kind of like it humanizes it a bit more, rather than just looking at them as a collective and thinking they're bad. you're looking at specific people and like how different people in a cult are. They're not just all one, like the same person, I guess.
I guess not necessarily. Do you think that only documentary has the power to do that, or have you seen similar representations in film? You know, fiction, not fiction film, but studio film. You know, short film, not like actual.
Yeah.
You know, that kind of thing. It can be fiction or non-fiction. So.
I think cults in fictional films are normally reserved for like horror films.
Yeah.
Yeah,
To be
definitely.
scared of, fear.
Do you know any particular examples?
The Ritual. Yeah, or Helter Skelter, or yeah.
There's that season of American Horror Story, isn't there? The Roanoke one, which is about a cult, and that's all really graphic and violent.
Yeah. Have you seen the intro to that?
No, I
There
can't
was
say.
about a different season. There was a season called Cult, which is the one I
so
showed you.
Oh, is that the one with Donald Trump? Well, about
Yeah.
clowns. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, then again, that's on about political stuff again, isn't
Yeah.
it? Yeah.
But you know, have any of you had any particular, you know, what's really stuck with you from your favourite, perhaps? Well, having said, let's rephrase that. Let's go along and sort of. Could everybody tell us about their going from Dan's side to Ellie? What a particularly memorable cult documentary they've watched would be, and why it stuck with them.
There's a fella on YouTube, and he goes back and goes through all these kind of little pieces of internet history, not limited to around the internet, but just things, the smaller stuff that you might not have heard of. He did one about the Indian bloke that I talked about earlier, and there was another one about a group of people that started like a house where they'd live their lives as video game characters, and they would attract more and more people.
Yeah.
And it was all sort of years later, everybody had found out all this information through like forum boards and stuff.
Yeah.
So he chronicled.
Was it particularly violent? It's like information, or and was it?
It's disturbing.
Yeah.
The theme running throughout all of these videos is that there's some sort of like disturbing version to it.
So would you say that it's that twist, that kind of like unexpected element, that would keep you hooked on that?
It's not. Yeah, it's just the shock value of it, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
realising that some people have lived like that. And
Would any of you consider the person that Dan saw in that documentary, or the group that Dan saw in that documentary, would any of you consider that to be a typical definition of a cult?
I guess so.
Yeah.
I guess moving on to Emily. Take your time, don't worry about it.
I mean, all that's coming to mind because I wouldn't say I really have watched a documentary specifically where it said it's a cult, but
It can be within expanded into popular
yeah.
media.
Well, no, because what's coming to mind is that Netflix documentary series, The Keepers, but it's not about a cult. It's about like sexual like violence in the Catholic Church, but it's coming to mind because it was talking about how it was a bit of a cult and hidden aspect
Well,
that they were keeping secret,
Yeah.
this violence that they were doing upon young people.
you're Catholic, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So did that particularly sort of resonate with you because of your sort of familial connection to it?
I'll say not particularly just because the documentary was American,
Yeah.
and me personally, my experience with the church has not been negative,
No.
but that's just because it's not that strong.
It's interesting that you said that actually, because Claire Ashman joined a sort of, I guess, what she describes as a sect of the Protestant church, and she very much just considered it another church that had problems, not so much a cult, but it's very much got the makings of it. And what you've just described there, you know, I personally, and I feel like, you know, a few academics would agree that that's a sect, maybe not so much a cult. But you know, within that, very much within that realm of an abusive social group.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that's perfectly relevant. Have you guys got any opinions on whether or not that is, you know, that constitutes that, or whether or not that's, you know, within the confines of this, of what you would consider a cult documentary?
Again, it goes back to what your definition of cult is, isn't it? I think so. I think it does, to an extent.
Yeah.
I think there's this group of people with similar or the same beliefs who are but inclusive. What they do is obviously they want to keep a secret, and I think obviously there's also an element of violence to it.
Mm.
So I've always associated with what a cult is.
Yeah.
Not necessarily extreme violence, but there's sort of something sinister about it.
Do you think the sinister? Do you think violence is a particularly core attraction across all of, documentary filmmaking?
Definitely.
Particularly, war documentaries and cult documentaries are amongst some of the, from what I've researched, some of the most popular on Netflix. And Netflix has set aside essentially a branch that just deals with those two subjects. And do you think it's key to the success of a cult documentary? Critically, perhaps.
I think a lot of documentaries try to get their message across through shock value, and I don't think there's many better ways of producing shock value than showing violence on film, especially real violence. So someone actually getting shot as opposed to a recreation on just a normal film. It's definitely gonna be shocking, and I think that also that in a weird way attracts people.
Yeah.
I think people want to be shocked.
Do you think there's something very core to human nature that wants that?
Definitely, yeah.
I think people are definitely attracted to violence, but like the detachment from it, that it's not like being inflicted upon them personally, but they like being as close to it as possible without having to. And like documentaries can make everything so cinematic now that you almost forget that it's real.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I've covered your favourite one, haven't I? What would you say?
Can't really think of any documentaries off my head. I mean, like a fictional film like The Wicker Man
Yeah.
is interesting,
Interesting.
and that it's like, at least from the outside, it looks like a very normal community.
Yeah.
And then it goes back to this thing that I said about how secretive cults are.
Yeah.
Like if you look from the outside in, you wouldn't really think there's much different about them.
Yeah.
Yeah, as you get further into the film, like more weird things happen, and then eventually, they commit a huge act of violence by burning this guy alive.
So do you think there's an immediate recognition of otherness, or do you think cults require a bit of digging to, really unearth the strange?
There's definitely quite digging, because I think the only really the way to truly understand the cult is to be a part of the cult.
Yeah.
I don't think you can ever, someone could tell you their experiences of it, but to actually have that experience, I don't think I don't think you can replicate it.
Mm. So moving on to your perhaps favourite.
I think Helter Skelter is the obvious choice for that one, mainly because they just have the people involved sort of reflecting on it.
Yeah, talk about that film's documentary style. Do you think it's trying to tell us something about perhaps the sensationalism of documentary?
I'm not too sure. I just mainly personally like it because you kind of get an insight into how they were manipulated and all the psychological stuff. That's why I personally like it. But
I think it's hard. It's easy to forget, and I almost just did myself, that film is essentially a form of documentary. It's a docudrama, and it's very much going off real events. But it did heighten a few of them to sort of really, impact the audience. And I guess that comes back to what Tom said. But that was going to be my last question, or my second to last question, which was, do you think that sensationalism is core? Do you think it's something that, Netflix in particular, and streaming services prioritise over the genuine understanding of how these people have been affected and things like that?
I think it'd be unfair to say yes as a sort of blanket statement, but I think definitely a lot of documentaries sort of take advantage of people's. I think there's an element of trust with documentaries that people have.
Yeah.
That people think that because it's documentary, what they're seeing is the truth.
Yeah. And so, do you think they have a sort of journalistic duty, in the same way as the news does?
Yeah, I think so, because they're depicting something that's real, and I think they have a responsibility to. Obviously, there's always going to be an element of subjectivity, such a subjective subject. But I think there's a responsibility to show, not just to provide that shock value, but there needs to be a reason for that shock value. Why they put it in there?
Yeah.
Are they trying to show, the violence of the cult, or are they just put it in there just to, get attention?
What are the rest of you guys' opinion on that, perhaps?
If it's like I said with sensationalism, if it gets too much, it's kind of distracting compared to like I watch a documentary. I watch it to learn something new, I learn about something new. But if it's too sensationalist, I kind of feel like I'm getting like just sort of a quite disingenuous version of the story, I guess.
Yeah.
You can definitely sense when you're being preached at
Yeah.
in a documentary.
So would you suggest that something that would focus upon the aftermath of those events and less upon, the actual violence and things like that would perhaps be a little bit sort of refreshing in kind of, representing how it's impacted individuals instead of addressing them as a collective? What's your thoughts on that? Please have a discussion amongst yourselves on that. And then.
It's a bit more difficult to sensationalise people's own experiences, because obviously they're saying it themselves. If you like showing what's going on in the cults, then it's a lot easier to heighten that for like the violence and interest aspect.
If I'm watching interviews and stuff with the people that are involved, I want that to accompany sort of the telling of the events, like with this documentary about the Waco thing. I'd want to hear people's stories, sort of augment the telling of the stories from like a factual point of view.
I think I'd like to see like what the sort of the consequences of what's happened.
How
So
to rebuild their life, perhaps.
yeah, instead of just telling me what happened to them,
Yeah.
like tell me like how it's affected them
Yeah.
and how what the lasting effects that's had on them.
And would you suggest that you'd like to see a particularly positive narrative, or would you like it to be sort of more in the way that it's being very objective, taking these experiences as they are, no matter what the outcome might have been? So maybe someone's moved on from it, somebody's still struggling with it, or somebody has rejected the cult mentality, but still shares some of the similar beliefs of it.
I want to hear what what they have to say. I don't think
Yeah.
I don't necessarily want there to be a positive outcome
You
because
don't want there to be a particular forced argument, perhaps.
no, because that again going back to the thing about truth, that's not truthful. If there isn't a positive end to the story, then don't force one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's come to the end of our questions there. I think that was very well. I really, really like those responses, guys. They were really good. Have you got anything you'd like to ask, Lydia? Or anything
I
you
think
feel
you've covered
comfortable
most of
about?
it.
Yeah. Do you feel comfortable with
Yeah.
it? Well, thanks so much. And is there anything you guys would like to know about the upcoming project and sort of, where you can find it, sort of where you think it should be found, and and sort of like what style of documentary really speaks to you, and how would you like to see that represented within our film that's coming?
I think with a documentary, you want to get it out as many ways as possible, make it as accessible, because you're telling facts, just telling a story, aren't you? It's not fictional, so you want it to reach as many people as you can.
Just like one tiny thing. It's just I don't like documentaries where the filmmakers put themselves in the documentary. If that makes sense.
As in,
when you hear it off camera, you just hear someone.
Like Louis Theroux sort of thing.
Yeah.
where they're trying to make themselves.
Yeah, when it's not, because documentary's not about. I know you're a great guy, Ian, but documentary's not about you.
I'm the producer anyway. I wouldn't be.
So yeah, I don't want to see you just having a conversation. I want to see just them.
Yeah, no. I'm glad that you agree with that. Yeah, because we never considered. There's a few we've seen that have been going down that route, and we've just kind of you need to build a personality before. That sounded rude.
Oh, just because stuff
It's
like
up to you to
it's
build.
like Louis Theroux.
Yeah.
People go to watch it just for Louis Theroux. I don't think even if you see tires on the poster, the name Louis Theroux is bigger than like
Yeah.
what he's
Yeah.
actually talking about.
And I think that very much came through in his Scientology documentary, which received some mixed critical acclaim. Just said it was very much a vehicle for Louis Theroux, and a case study on him more so than, you know, more so than that. That was a film that very much failed in its access in that respect. So it's interesting that you said that. It's a really interesting point. So, like, you know, if you feel that the removal of personal sort of impact is quite key to sort of an unbiased
Yeah, definitely.
thing. Brilliant. Brilliant stuff.
Yeah. I guess as well, just be mindful of the power of your own editing, if this is going to make sense, because I know when you watch a documentary and you hear the sad music starts playing, and I know from like a media studies perspective we can like detach from it and be like, oh well, this is meant to make us feel sympathetic, but maybe like a more passive audience member it's not, and it's going to be more emotive because you hear the sad music and it's, you know, slow motion, black and white, whatever,
Yeah.
but then it becomes one-sided and you're shifted to think a certain way.
It's really, really useful.
Like, what's coming to mind is like the Shane Dawson documentary series, and it'll be like, oh, and Jake Paul had a sad life, and the music starts playing, and I love him, and I can appreciate like what Shane Dawson's trying to do, but also maybe don't,
No,
because
especially, yeah.
it's
And because, you know, the real, you know, we want your approval, but we also want our subject approval on this documentary. We really want. That's kind of how we know we've done our job.